Good evening. My name's Andrew Leigh and this is Nick Terrell. We're here this evening for a virtual launch of Reconnected, a Community Builder's Handbook. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people on whose lands we're meeting tonight. Daranuna, Daranunawal, Yongu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Nanawalwari, Dawawari, Dindi, Nanyalindinyin. We'd like to acknowledge any Indigenous people who are listening to us this evening. We're acutely aware of how ironic it is to be launching a book about community connectedness, connecting with you only virtually. We'd love to be doing this in a room packed with people, because that's how we believe community connection can work best. But of course, social distancing applies. We'd like to thank ANU very much for providing us with this opportunity to connect virtually with you. We'd like to acknowledge too the great social connector of the books scene here in Canberra, Colin Steele, for being willing to provide us with this opportunity. Reconnected is a book that talks about how we can be a closer civic society. And it's born out of a concern that Australia has become disconnected. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Disconnected, which tracked some of the problems in Australian community life. And we begin Reconnected by updating those figures and tracking through how Australian social connectedness has fared. Sadly, the picture isn't pretty. The TV show Neighbours launched in 1985, and over the 35 years since, Australians now know half as many of our true neighbours as we used to. The same survey reveals we have half as many close friends. Since the 1950s, church-going has fallen by 2/3. Since the 1980s, the union membership rate has fallen by 2/3. If you look at the number of associations per Australian, that number is now a quarter of where it was in the late 1970s. We've seen a fall in volunteering, which particularly affected the number of firefighter volunteers available when this summer's bushfires hit. From 2010 to 2019, the number of firefighter volunteers fell by a fifth, which placed extraordinary pressure on those battling the blazes last summer. We've seen a decline in donations. We've even seen a decline in Australians' willingness to complete government surveys, which provide a community benefit since they allow us to know how businesses are faring and how the labour market is doing. All of these trends have left Australia less a society of we and more a society of me. We've become more individualistic and less connected. But Reconnected isn't just about talking about the problem, it's about finding the solution. And for that, let me hand you over to Nick Terrell to talk about how we began tracking the groups that are doing a great job and learning from them to put together the lessons of Reconnected.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Ngambri and the Ngunnawal people, and also to acknowledge the land was never ceded. So let's just jump into how this all began. So at least 6 or 7 years ago, I think, this issue again was coming up. As Andrew mentioned, he looked at this in 2010. He looked at this in Disconnected, and of course that was about a trend. So it seemed reasonable to check how that was going, and we started to set up some consultations around the country. By the end of the process, we had met with over 1,000 different community builders and charity leaders from Perth to Darwin, Brisbane, Hobart, Launceston, all over the country. And we had been asking them what was working, what they could share with others if they were given the opportunity, and also what obstacles they were facing. And after many fruitful sessions, we learnt a lot, we took in a lot, and then we began to distill that and look at what were the things that community builders across the country could learn from each other and share. So that was the start, and that I guess in mentioning that, I want to acknowledge all the people who were a part of that and whose great ideas and enthusiasm and time and engagement we drew upon, who are all, I suppose, certainly as I researched towards the end of this project and was writing and researching in more detail, those were the people, I guess, who I felt I owed most to and was really working on behalf of. And not all of those lessons and all of those stories are in the book. We would love to have been able to represent everything that we learnt, but that would have been a vast tome. But it's important that that people realise there's a sort of wealth. This is the tip of the iceberg that is guided by all that stuff that went on beneath, which drew in a lot of people who made important contributions. One thing I guess I also wanted to acknowledge from the outset and about social capital, which is underneath this whole Reconnected idea, there is this desire to build this resource, is that while social capital is something that a lot of people enjoy and see the benefit of, there is a greater challenge for many people who, like any form of capital, have less and who have less to begin with and don't have that sort of capacity to bring it to bear on their lives in the way that others who are born with maybe more advantage or opportunity can do. So that's something that's important to remember, and it's something that a lot of the people that we looked at certainly were aware of as well. Like any form of capital, the less you have, the harder it is to build your resources, and that's one of the big problems that a lot of these stories address. Having said that, I guess another thing, a bit of context, a bit of topical things that went on towards the end of the process, actually. Andrew, you would remember this. First of all, as we were sort of bringing things to a finalist draft, bushfires spread across the country, and a lot of communities were put in very difficult positions, drawing on all the resources that a really well-connected community will naturally have, and in some cases finding real strains and challenges, but also seeing in a very real, concrete, visceral way why it matters, why these connections matter, and the benefits that they bring. And then just as that subsided somewhat, coronavirus hit the shores, and again, as we sit here in our virtual launch, that changed a lot of the way people were able to interact and to support each other, and that really crystallized again a lot of really important, for a lot of people who maybe hadn't had to think about the networks and the support that they had in their community, in their neighbourhoods, among their work colleagues, sporting clubs, other groups that they're a part of, what it meant if that was put under threat or in jeopardy, and what priority they would put on sort of rebuilding or shoring up those connections. So those things really, to some extent, energized some of the, I suppose, the urgency of what we were trying to bring into this book, and I think they really did crystallize or focus some of the what we were trying to sort of deliver from this process.
Thanks, Nick. And one of the things that I really enjoyed working on during the book was engaging with the question of how technology is affecting our lives. It was something that I touched on in Disconnected, but in the decades since, there's been so much more that's been written on this. And so we have a chapter called Reconnecting, which is about how to mindfully use technology in a way that augments face-to-face interactions rather than supplanting it. We're worried that the period since 2005 has seen quite a significant worsening of mental health among young Australians. The share of high schoolers who say that they're very stressed was a third in 2005 and is now up to half. We've even seen indicators of worse outcomes such as self-harm. And these measures seem to have worsened most for teenage girls, which is consistent with the notion that the way in which girls seek to harm one another when they're fighting can be through damaging social networks rather than through physical interactions, as tends to be more common with boys. So much of what we're seeing troubles me as a parent, and yet there also is a wonderful wealth of information out there about how to use these technologies well. In the workplace, Dana Boyd advocates an email sabbatical. Others have suggested getting rid of the notifications on your smartphone for social media apps, pointing out that they're designed by the same people that design poker machines and understand how to exploit our psychological biases. There's Silicon Valley designers who are much more reticent than most of my friends to give their kids tablets and let them have unfettered access to the internet, who have a lot more rules around it in order to ensure that kids have the time for backyard soccer games and informal interactions, and that these addictive technologies don't take over our lives. And we've also seen such wonderful use of technology during the pandemic. Catherine Barrett, whose name is featured on the front of our book, is set up a page called The Kindness Pandemic, a Facebook page which invited Australians to share stories of generosity and kindness through the coronavirus lockdown. People like the neighbour who saw that the person living next door was doing it tough, homeschooling kids, and so dropped off a coffee on the doorstep in the morning. The people who paid grocery bills for the tearful person in front of them at the supermarket who'd forgotten their credit card. And at a time in which the media was full of stories of people fighting over toilet paper and supermarket aisles, the Kindness Pandemic showed the best of Australia and encouraged other people to reconnect. We talked too about Astrid Jorgensen's Couch Choir, an initiative that flowed out of her pub choir initiatives in Brisbane, which had brought thousands of people together to sing. Obviously, singing isn't feasible during a pandemic, and so Couch Choir crowdsourced people to sing songs like David Bowie's Heroes, bringing together Australians and people around the world in order to remind ourselves of those connections. Including myself. Yes, I got my three little boys singing one of the Killers songs that Astrid Jorgensen put together. So there is great potential, we think, to cyber connect, but it's important that we get on top of those technologies rather than allowing them to get on top of us. Nick, do you want to say something about some of your other favourite bits of the book?
Yes, I do. So I thought I might focus on some of the chapter that is specifically about social connectors, social purpose and social connection. A lot of the entire book is about people who are bringing people together, increasing participation, but that chapter in particular had people who either had set out with that purpose or had discovered that they were achieving that end with great success alongside some other goal perhaps that they thought they were best serving. And the one, I suppose, a quote that I wanted to maybe start that discussion with was, which I will just grab because I did want to get this right, was from Nick Maisie, who started Befriend in Perth. He was working at a university, he was training to be an occupational therapist, and he was a liaison of sorts, and he got an email from a guy named Tim out of the blue, and it just said, "I don't have any friends and I'm wondering if anyone is interested in getting to know me." And that struck Nick. This was coming from a young man. It was so an adult writing to him as another adult saying, "Don't have any friends, you know, what should I do? How's this gonna, how shall we work this out? I'm interested, I want to make friends, I just not sure how to do it." And I guess for Nick Maisie that was a striking thing, and it kind of changed his direction a little, and he sort of decided, well, okay, let's look at this and let's solve this problem. Adults aren't, you know, they get through their childhood, adolescence, you sort of bring people, you bring friendship groups with you. It's sort of part of education and, you know, university, whatever. But when you get to a certain age, the sort of structures maybe change a little, and if you move city or you maybe a relationship breaks down, then a lot of people find there's just a question mark. How do I make friends? And so Nick set up Befriend, and one of the main things that I guess struck me about Befriend was the focus on just simply the invitation, how important that is to just make the invitation to people and keep making it. And once you've got people along, and these seem very, I suppose, intuitive things that people maybe think, well, of course, but when people come, you welcome them, and you have people whose role is to set up these opportunities, invite people to these situations and welcome them, and make sure that a whole group understands that there are people there who want them to be there and want to know about them. And these sorts of, I guess, intentional social architecture structures are they're just surprisingly successful, I suppose. Not surprisingly successful, they're surprisingly simple but effective in that, you know, creating that for people who aren't sure what they're supposed to do or where they fit in. It just initiates that process, and they begin to learn as a part of that. And another group that had a similar, I suppose, talking to the founder of this group, which was Patricia Lauria, the group being Friendline. I was talking about how Friendline came into being. It struck me as an unusual, everyone I'm sure listening to this has heard of Lifeline, and everyone's familiar with the concept of a helpline that people in crisis can reach out to and get some counselling or some guidance, some assistance, someone to listen to their problems in crisis times and offer some support. So Friendline is like that, but it's not about crisis, and there's no, I suppose, there isn't that sort of jeopardy, I suppose, about the outcome. And so when the Friendline operators are talking to someone, they totally turn the principles of the crisis line upside down. The crisis lines are supposed to be quite controlled, they're impersonal, not in the sense that they're not empathetic, but they talk about the person who's rung,
yes,
speaks and expresses their situation. Friendline counsellors are trained to introduce things about themselves. So they will reciprocate, and they will throw things back at the person who's rung, often looking for some human interaction, and they are encouraged and trained and guided to introduce their own personality into the conversation. And the reason for that is because they're not just, it's not just a more interesting and rewarding conversation for the caller. The caller, if they continue this interaction and call again, they learn how to have a conversation and how to share and sort of communicate about themselves, which for many people in this situation calling on the friend line, they don't have other opportunities to do that. So it actually trains them in an area that maybe they need to strengthen experience skills, social skills that maybe have trailed off a little. And again, that service came about because Patricia was just hearing that people were missing this, that they weren't in crisis, they weren't, things weren't they weren't in the situation where they would call Lifeline or feel that they could or should, but they needed some sort of support. So this service came about, and it's particularly during the last 6 months, they have found a lot more people calling, which again has been, for them, I suppose it's shown the value of what they're doing, but also I guess the need. And I guess on that principle, another organisation who again had a simple intentional sort of approach to this was Lively, set up by Anna Donaldson in Queensland, I believe. So Anna, I guess, saw two problems that really engaged her, and one was young people who were struggling to get into the workforce. Again, this goes back to the question of social capital and who has it and who doesn't and why. She was seeing young people who hadn't had, they didn't have the networks, or they didn't have the experience, or they were struggling to put together that sort of piece of the resume that says to an employer, I can show up routinely, I'm reliable, I can be a good employee. And these people they were struggling to get into the job market, and she was also seeing older people who were both lonely but also struggling with the digital skills that really can, for maybe an isolated person, begin some of that re-engagement and give them ways to communicate with relatives or friends who aren't around. So she put those two together, and she developed this program where young people would be matched with an older person who they would they'd be matched up, and they would effectively have two goals. One was to teach digital literacy, so the older person would begin that sort of adventure in the wide world of technology, but also they were trained, and their objective was to create a friendship. So they were, again, and quite intentionally, the training was, there was an element to the training that was giving them an empathy and knowledge of perhaps the kind of life that the older generation, the people they were supporting and teaching, what their life might have been like, and some experiences that they could relate to or sort of empathise with, and just to sort of start that bridging of the generation gap. So again, it sort of has a symmetry that makes sense, but that element of seeing what might be the shortfall if you just threw these people together, and making sure that you'd already sort of prepared the way there. a similar, I guess, and these are just some of the clever things that really stuck with me. A program called Our Place, which the Australian Centre of Social Innovation, TAXI, in Adelaide, developed, Carla Clarence and Kerry Jones. And this was to address a problem which is a very serious problem. Women over 55 who are at risk of homelessness, and there's many reasons for that. Economics, low super, and not only, I suppose, are they financially vulnerable, but they're also at risk that things aren't going to improve perhaps for them. They're at the point where the vulnerabilities that have built up through having to leave the workforce to raise children, or perhaps they've separated from someone and been left with a sort of an unstable housing situation. So there's this population of women in that demographic who are vulnerable and at much higher risk of homelessness than maybe the rest of the population. And when Carla and Kerry decided that this was a problem that needed to be addressed, they looked at some overseas models. There are shared housing sort of models in very good ones in Holland and Sweden, where young people and old people can sort of be find a setting where they can live in the same sort of, I guess, high density kind of scenario, and there's a kind of mutual support, socialization. But when they advertised or sort of went out looking for subjects in Australia, they were overwhelmed by the willingness of subjects. The female subjects over 55 were all there and keen, but they couldn't find the younger cohort to match them with. So they figured, well, this confirms the problem. We know, therefore, let's not co-house these women with younger people, let's try and co-house them together. So that created the next step, or I guess the problem that they needed to fix was, well, you've got these people who need now to share their lives, but that's a hard problem. That's not something you can do like that. So what they developed was a process whereby, in an accelerated way, they could build the trust that two people would need to bring the resources of two people, which would give them the stability that would really set them up, and which was so much needed for this group, without the risk that maybe it would go bad, or that it was too sudden, or the match wasn't right. And again, they found an interesting thing that it didn't matter so much, I guess, ideologies or ideals and sort of political, where do they sit? What mattered was values that sat below that. So again, that guided a program that they'll sort of develop and that will allow, probably, it's a module of sorts that can be utilised as this problem is better addressed through more sort of established housing programs. This will sort of sit behind that and make sure that the matches work. And that, again, really struck me as a great innovation.
And one of the things we tried to do was not just to tell wonderful stories, but also to work out what are the golden threads that connect them together. So we were inspired by the bank robber Willie Sutton, who, when asked why he robbed banks, said, well, because that's where the money is. So we came up with the idea of Sutton's law of social capital. If you want to build social capital, you should go where the need is. And one of the things that I love about Lively and Taxi is that both of them focus on areas where there is substantial need as they look to build social capital. So Nick, in advertising for the book conversation tonight, we've got a number of questions, so I think we can take it in turns to throw them to one another. The opening question is from Rodley. How do you think this COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to reconnecting Australian communities?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, we found that question really a useful one in the final months putting this book together. And you've already alluded to, for instance, the kindness pandemic, which is it's a Facebook page, a Facebook group, and now a broader network of information and connections, which Dr. Catherine Barrett set up in Melbourne at one point in the very early days of isolation and the sort of public health measures. They had hit close to 600,000 page likes, people who'd connected. And that happened very quickly.
Yeah.
I think 560,000 people maybe where it peaked around the world. And it just really showed the appetite and as I guess most people can probably sort of recall, there was a sort of natural stage where things that you couldn't do without, you sort of made sure that you kind of felt secure that things were, you were all right on those shelter and staples sort of front. But then the next thing that people were really doing was, well, now that I can't interact with my networks, how do I fill that gap, and how do I make sure that the networks that I'm a part of or that I know are important are still healthy? And that was really striking. It happened across many different fronts. There were many different groups, particularly on a small scale, neighbourhood scale, streets, people setting up off-the-cuff quick-fire mutual aid groups on, like I say, it might be a suburb-wide couple of streets or just a single street, people going around with flyers and offering help. So I guess it really, and a lot of people, I guess, got a very direct experience of or at least it made them sort of really see what things might be like without those networks, and if they were to fail or really weaken beyond that point where you could rely on them or get the benefits of them, and what that would look like. And I guess in a way, a theme I guess that we do that is important in the book is that these networks are very useful. They're good for your sort of good for you across a range of different metrics, but they're also just very enjoyable. They make people happy and satisfied and feel fulfilled. So for people to see, to get that experience, and in some senses, I'm sure there was an element that a lot of people had more time, and they were spending more time in their community, in their neighbourhood. But there was, it was very clear that people would put the energy in, and I guess the question for all of us now is, what happens next? It's undeniable that these networks crystallized. They came into being, or they muscled up when we needed them, for some. But what happens as we continue, if we establish a new normal, or if things were to return to previously, how do we make sure that people sort of maintain that enthusiasm, and what were the really meaningful parts of it that we can put in the bank?
Yes, because I think about the distinction between September 11th, when there was a temporary surge in community connectedness in America that very quickly went away, and World War II, which seemed to put in place a much more lasting change in the civic connectedness of what we now call the greatest generation.
Yes, indeed. So I will now put a question to you on behalf of Natalie, who asks, how important do you think neighbourhoods are in building community, and did you find examples of best practice in building community at the neighbourhood level?
Natalie, we loved the way in which a team of residents in Western Sydney set out to connect their community to save their local park. Liverpool Council wrote to them saying that they were getting rid of a number of unused local parks, and one of the park in their street was scheduled for development. And the people in the street responded by mobilising together and becoming politically active. The street hadn't been previously a hub of social capital, but became much more connected as the community mobilised to engage with the council, not to see the park turned into more housing, but to see it turned into a better park. So the Farrington Court, is it, Nick?
Farrington Crescent.
Farrington Crescent.
Farrington Collaborative was the group, the sort of notional name of the group. As they came together, yeah.
So I love that the Farrington Collaborative's ability to not only push back against what they saw as an unfair decision, but to build something that was much more lasting. I hope that many of the mutual aid groups that have emerged through coronavirus will do the same. It's striking to me in my own neighbourhood how straightforward that is. My wife and I organise our annual street get-together every December, and it is almost comically straightforward to organise. We take last year's invitation, change the date, change a few details so it doesn't quite look like a copy-paste exercise, photocopy the invitation and put it in our neighbours' letterboxes. When the appointed day comes, BYO ensures that there's plenty more food and drink than anyone can consume, and we spend an hour pleasantly chatting away with our neighbours. It's worth doing because we like our neighbours, but it would be worth doing even if we didn't like our neighbours, because that community connection lasts right through the year. So there's terrific ways in which I think it's straightforward to maintain those connections. Nick, let me throw to you the question from Sam. How do you think communities can become better prepared for the upcoming climate challenges?
Well, that is one of the, again, having had the final stages of pulling all these ideas together, being in a climate of, let's say, at least partial emergency and a lot of really serious challenges to how we want our communities to go on, particularly, when there seem to be elements of that under threat. And obviously climate change holds that kind of threat. I guess perhaps the political, we have a chapter on political participation, and that's important for people to see ways that collectively they can get outcomes, find points in the political or the or maybe it's the community level, points where they can exert influence and change things. We found particularly maybe a good parallel is Amnesty International's My New Neighbour, which is a program designed to change the way some parts of the country looked at refugees. So it's a difficult issue for some, and an issue that had been made very controversial by certain voices, certain viewpoints and political styles had really turned that into a divisive discussion. My New Neighbour took an approach that took not just a a former refugee who maybe was integrating into a new community, but took a person from that community who had played a part and put them together to go to communities and say the two sides of that story. This is what it meant to me to be integrated into this community, but for the person who was playing the role of spokesperson for that community, how valuable that was for them and all the benefits and that they got from that new relationship or that involvement. So I think there's probably a similar challenge on the climate change, the challenges there, how to get past that divisive political narrative, but there's also some practical lessons, and particularly a group that is not in the book, but strategies, I suppose, that were reflected in other parts, which is building wide partnerships. So there was a group from the Geelong peripheral around Melbourne, the regional area there, that had become really, really effective by absorbing all the different expertise and the different sort of the coastlands group, the grasslands group, they had planning experts, that all the aligned sort of interests and the people who had a conservation sort of mindset or a planning approach to climate and to habitat gradually had developed this sort of body of not just expertise but influence, which made them very effective in when they identified a solution. They already had a broad array of sort of they had paths forward in all the areas that they needed to. And again, that's the strength of that those bridging bonds outside these tight networks that had their own purpose, but they developed the networks that made them a formidable alignment of so they got things done because they could move effectively in all the fronts they needed to. Okay, well, this is a question from Shoba. How can we rebuild our communities after COVID-19?
So I think, Shoba, this is partly about trying to do more than one thing at the same time, if we can. One of the ideas that we flag up in Reconnected is a repurposing of an old George Orwell line. In 1984, people remember there is a removal of a whole lot of words and creation of new newspeak words, one of which is double plus good. 1984 is a dystopia, but we think in our Reconnected utopia we can take that idea of double plus good social capital, in which we're trying to do two good things at the same time. One of the examples I really enjoy is the Hunter Intrepid Landcare groups, which have waterway cleanups, so you can get fit and improve the natural environment at the same time. In Britain, the Good Gym pairs runners with lonely older people who get a visit once a week and are referred to as the trainer. So the reason for getting out of bed on a Saturday morning isn't just you want to go and stretch your legs, it's because there is an older person who needs a visit. Obviously this has been put on pause during COVID, but it's something that I think will come back because it has an enduring value. There's people who want to get fit and want to be doing something good in the community. I also love the way in which Greening Australia has created singles tree planting events in which you get to improve the natural environment and potentially meet the love of your life. So do you plant here often is the line they suggest. But there's also plenty of chat about how you can build those sort of informal connections. It's a bit like a romantic version of befriend or friendline, helping to augment face-to-face connections within the structure of a terrific volunteer organisation. In Shoba, we really admired many of the groups who are thinking creatively about how to help serve more than one purpose, how to do double plus good social capital. Nick, the next question is from Vincent. What suggestions would you recommend for those seeking to build meaningful, purpose-based communities online?
I guess the first thing I would suggest would be to, if possible, if possible, to tie it to something practical and concrete. So to use that community to bring about something in the real world, the physical world, and as an example, Gather My Crew, which is essentially it's a platform to galvanise loose connections, loose social connections into a network that you might, traditionally imagine a village would sort of provide the support that a village might provide to anyone known in the community. Gather My Crew allows people to set up a small network. It's effectively a kind of closed social network, but it's tied to tasks. So someone who is experiencing an extra burden, there might be illness, or there might be, I think a nice example, a man who was a regular at a dog park, and one day he broke his leg and he couldn't come to the park, and the people at the park noticed he wasn't there. They noticed that this regular was missing, and some of the people found out, they did a bit of asking around, they found that he'd been confined to home, and they put together a network from the dog park. They signed people up at the dog park on this platform, and were able to share out the tasks that he needed while he was unable to sort of do his own shopping or walk his dog, for instance. So that's it's an online tool. It's using the technology to generate or to extract the benefits of that sort of what he might not have thought of as his tribe or his community, and they may not have also, but in that circumstance, it distilled that out of the social setting. But probably, I guess, if we're staying in the online world, it's the most compelling example that we saw perhaps was Digivol and Citizen Science, which is a vast and impressive network of people who share a commitment to science and to geography, biology, natural science, and through the wonders of digitization and the platform that was developed by the National Museum in Sydney, the Australian Museum in Sydney, Rhiannon Stevens and some colleagues who explained to us how this works. It's an amazing, it links into an amazing and very impressive and quite absorbing world, which I really wanted to go into a lot more as I was writing the book, but couldn't because I had to write the book.
Did you try it out yourself?
I did. I was able to observe I monitored some camera traps in sub-Saharan Africa to check on what specimens were in a certain area. So it's things like that that are amazing, and that you can do from anywhere. So Digivol, Citizen Science, these platforms that allow people to find other people like them. There are elements of that, or people who share their interest, but who they couldn't interact with by any means without that, and also people who can volunteer and support causes and purposes that are meaningful to them, that for various access reasons or just convenience they couldn't get to. So these platforms and that online sort of purpose has allowed people who just can't do traditional volunteering to make a contribution and to feel that fulfillment, that sense of purpose. And I guess my favourite little story that tops that off is Teresa van der Huel, I think is an amateur fungi expert from the South Coast who was Digivol's top volunteer. As we were writing, we were tracking how many volunteer tasks she'd done. It went from, I think, 450,000. She's working up towards 550,000. It sort of was hitting a new peak every time I looked. So she's just a huge contributor to the digitisation project through Digivol, which they could never achieve without this online support, and which will make, which has an added benefit of bringing the natural, the collection and all the data and the information that they have in that collection will now be available to scientists all around the world, again through that online community. And Teresa, yes, while saying she sleep is a waste of her time, she remembered her favourite, I suppose, reward, and her sense, I suppose, a way that she sort of showed that, you know, it's not just doing some tasks, it's not just sort of the leaderboard, ticking off the numbers and moving up. Her favourite project, which was transcribing some Antarctic diaries, and the museum was able to organise for her to have a phone conversation and to interact with the scientists who had produced those diaries. So for her it was like, it confirmed that, you know, this big project that was very remote from her if she was, you know, not able to do this through the digital and online space, that she was a part of that and that, you know, it was appreciated and acknowledged.
Yes, and it's a reminder that the world's most popular encyclopedia, Wikipedia, is volunteer produced. The world's best used operating system, Linux, is another piece of volunteer labour.
The next question is from Wendy, and she has asked, do you think our work ethic and how we value productivity versus care need to change in order to build community, and do you look at that in your book?
Wendy, we do, and we don't see any contradiction between a well-functioning economy and a strong society. Indeed, one of the striking things as an economist looking at social capital is to see how fundamental it is to good business interactions. If people don't trust one another, then they can't do business with a handshake. They have to write painfully extensive contracts because they have to be worried about being ripped off all the time. Commerce flows more smoothly with social capital, so we think that a more connected society will be a more productive society. We also learned a lot, Wendy, from looking at how some of Australia's best corporates are engaging with philanthropy. There's a lovely tale out of the technology company Atlassian, which had a complicated sign-up process for its workplace giving program. You could choose from a vast menu of potential charities to give towards, and very few of their employees did so. Then they revamped the system to choose just one charity and a 6-second sign-up, and they saw enrolments go through the roof. We've also seen some really interesting initiatives among corporates in ensuring that their volunteering programs aren't mere pretense, but are actually using the best skills of their employees. So if you're an accounting company and your idea of corporate volunteering is to send a bunch of accountants to go and paint a fence on a Friday afternoon, that's probably not to their comparative advantage. But if you think about it a bit longer, if you partner with appropriate organisations, say using the skills and wherewithal of Volunteering Australia, you might find a whole set of little charities and not-for-profits that would love some advice from professional accountants in order to be able to function better. So we've really admired some of the best work that's being done in corporate Australia, moving away from the narrow Milton Friedman notion that the purpose of a corporation is merely to add value to the shareholders, and recognising that good corporations are there for their customers, for their workers, and for the broader community as a whole, and that companies have an important role to play in reconnection. Nick, I notice we've got just 5 minutes left to go on the podcast. I wonder if there's something that you enjoyed about the things that we found in the book that you wanted to close on. Some favourite chapter or observation or idea?
I wouldn't confine it to a particular chapter or a particular idea. I was, I guess, again and again impressed and really, I guess, I felt the enthusiasm so often from the people that I was talking to. Research is, to begin with, an abstract thing. We came across a lot of good ideas, a lot of good platforms, principles, approaches, but when you talk to the people who actually, who through their own experience and through their interaction with other people or their understanding of a particular need or a particular problem, the people who had committed their life, their career, all their resources and energy to solving that problem, I was just again and again just impressed and felt really privileged and I guess excited to be able to put some of their stories and try and convey a sense of that enthusiasm, which I feel, I hope that the readers will see and feel the same way. There's just some really great examples of how fulfilling it can be to achieve these kind of effects and to take that step that allows people to feel, to find their tribe or to connect to a purpose. Just again and again that impressed me, and I guess that's at the start when I acknowledged all those people that we learned from. That's what I feel was very important, and that I wanted to be in the book. What about you?
I was much the same. I mean, it is that real irony, isn't it, where you look at the numbers, you see that Australia is much less socially connected than we were a generation ago. And then you walk into the room and you meet these amazing people and they just blow you away. We have a chapter there where we showcase 4 of the great social entrepreneurs we met. Matt Napier, whose campaigns to raise awareness and resources around global poverty, a man who has bounced an AFL ball across Australia and kicked a soccer ball across Africa. We talk about Juliet Wright, who founded GiveIt, a platform which operates as a virtual warehouse for allowing people to donate a laptop or a washing machine to somebody who's lost everything in floods. Jack Manning Bancroft, who founded the Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience, and who came to realise that his affluent and privileged friends could actually be brought on board and could be some of his greatest allies. And he says that he changed his view of those people in his Sydney University College as he saw so many of them rally around. And then Beck Scott, who turned her life into one of building a social purpose enterprise in Melbourne, and then acting not only to create jobs for people who didn't have them, but also to provide an incubator for a whole lot of social purpose enterprises. We've come to the end of our hour's conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight. Thanks to Colin, to ANU, to Black Ink for putting our book together and for being part of the conversation. If you've got more ideas to share, we'd love to hear from you. Please drop us an email, pick up the phone and tell us what you're doing to create a more connected Australia.